Welcome to Practically Political and happy holidays. I'm Dave Spencer.
And I'm Carrie Sheffield, and happy holidays to y'all. We're excited to have you here.
Great to have you here. All right, Carrie, as you would say, let's get right to it. With the election of Raphael Warnock as the 51st Senator, the 118th Congress is finally set. And to put it fairly, I think Republicans are a little disappointed at their performance in the midterms. We can go through all the stats and how Biden did better than expected and Republicans did worse. But really, my question for you as someone who's a level-headed, pragmatic Republican, what candidate advice would you give our party as the best in terms of the best way to move forward after, to put it mildly, a disappointing set of elections?
Yeah, it was disappointing in Georgia. I think a big part of why conservatives lost and was that the game has changed since COVID when it comes to mail-in, and Republicans are just, we're going to show up on election day and that's the only time we're going to vote, and it just puts them inherently behind. And that's a big part when you're talking about election week or election month, and now you're just going in election day, like there's just going to be this asymmetry and you're already fighting with one hand behind your back.
Yeah, Walker was down by 200,000 votes that morning. I mean, how do you make that up, right?
Yeah, it's a huge deficit. And so I think rather than being in denial of where reality is today, that would be a big piece of advice, is that you gotta pivot. I mean, that's and Democrats played catch up because Republicans, back in the 90s, they were the pioneers when it came to direct mail, and they were cutting edge in terms of reaching voters that way. And Democrats played catch up, and then the Democrats were leading on the web. And then, Trump was leading on social media and going around the traditional media gatekeepers. And, it's a game of ping pong. So I think looking at the long game, putting in perspective, that's part of my advice that I would give. And also just focus on where are some areas where we could get some wins in terms of overlap. Where can we find some agreement? How can we encourage work? That's something that I think we both agree on in terms of creating jobs. How can we, because liberals, they want to subsidize unemployment. Conservatives want to subsidize work, but Democrats in general like subsidies. So maybe there's some place there that we can work on in reforming the earned income tax credit, things like that, criminal justice reform. So I would focus on trying to get those wins. And then, I think that there are just, at the state level, I would also recommend focusing at the state level. There are lots of things that can happen at the state level to push forward momentum on things like pro-life, things like economic up. And it's the laboratory of states is fascinating to see how the economic engines are happening in conservative states. And so just keep doing that.
Well, I think, I agree with you about early voting. And the funny thing was that I think there was a certain recent presidential candidate who crapped on early voting so much that it encouraged a lot of his fellow party members not to vote, particularly in things like the Georgia runoff. So that's something to think about. But what about candidate quality? Do you think that's it? Because, I think very realistically, we could have been talking about Senator Ducey in Arizona and Senator McCormick in Pennsylvania and Senator Collins in Georgia. Right? So how much of that do you think was a factor? And do you think maybe, because my theory is, again, my 2 cents is I think it was a combination of two things. It was a combination of people feeling that not the whole Republican Party, but the dominant MAGA wing particularly was too extreme on things like abortion, on a lot of stuff that was going on the election denialism and all that. So that was part one of it. And part two of it, Biden really did get a lot of stuff done. They passed a lot of bills. A lot of it was bipartisan. And so I think the American people thought, geez, these people are extreme. The Democrats, I don't like Joe Biden. I don't really approve of him that much, but the party's getting stuff done. Some of this stuff like prescription drugs and other things really has a direct effect on my life. A lot of the stuff is bipartisan, the CHIPS bill, the veterans bill. So I think those were the main factors as well. And again, it gets back to candidate quality. If you run good candidates, I think Mitch McConnell was having nightmares about Richard Murdoch and Sharon Engel and, Todd Aiken and all these really fringe candidates that were nominated before that just were great in the primaries but couldn't win in the general. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think, you want the best candidate for the state. And that isn't always going to be the best person in the primary. And being that forward looking is important. But I think that the major driver, I would say, is the structural change in mail-in balloting that the Democrats are just excelling at. And that's and Biden is very unpopular, and his agenda is going to be blocked. So I think in many respects, this election was a referendum against his agenda because it's now going to be blocked because the House, he's going to be dealing with investigations, and he's also going to see a lot of his things just go by the wayside. And I think that that's good for worker productivity, to stop so much of this crazy spending, and his, I believe, executive overreach on student loans, total pandering. I believe it's illegal. The courts have put a stop to it. Those sort of shenanigans, I think, are going to be stopped. But I think that the question of candidate quality is important, but I think it's also important, though. And so, yes, maybe this is where we can both agree. Candidate quality is important. But then once the voters have chosen in the primary, then you coalesce behind it and you do everything you can to get that person over the finish line. So I think it's a two-part thing.
I agree. But what was really fascinating was you look at a lot of these states, right? And it turned out it wasn't just independents who were voting Democratic. It was actually some Republicans, a fair amount of Republicans in states like Georgia who were turning out. I mean, look how well all Republicans in Georgia did, except Herschel Walker, all right? Great turnout. A lot of Republicans said, you know what? I can vote for Brian Kemp. I can vote for Brad Raffensperger, but I just can't vote for Herschel Walker. He is blatantly unqualified. And I think and again, what I've heard from you is I've heard early voting, but I haven't heard some real introspection. It was, okay, maybe is the MAGA stuff too extreme? Maybe do we have to take a look as a party and say, hey, is this not what the American people want? Is it time to move on? But to me, the trends in voting, when you see Republicans turning out and voting for every Republican except Dr. Oz or except Herschel Walker or except Blake Masters, that is really telling, don't you think?
Well, yeah, the ticket splitting, you saw that across the board where you had some on the Democrats too who were splitting for Republicans too. So I think that's something that to keep watching for, that ticket splitters. But let's move on to my question, which
but it didn't affect, though. Every Democratic incumbent was reelected for the first time since 1934 in the first midterm election. So it didn't seem to have the effect on the Democrat side that did on the Republican side. But anyway, go ahead.
You're talking about the Senate, not the House.
Yeah.
Because lots of incumbents lost in the House.
Yeah.
But